My date abandoned me halfway through our date. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. Joe and I met on Instagram, and Joe is a very good looking guy. Joe DM'd me first. The only reason I even opened his message was because of his profile picture. So it turns out Joe is a medical student, and I'm a nurse. Now I want you guys to understand something. From Instagram, we went over to WhatsApp. And on WhatsApp, we talked for 3 weeks. Every single day, morning, noon, and night. He did all the right things. He initiated the conversation. He would say good morning. Then he would text me around lunchtime asking me how I was. He would send me pictures every now and then. For example, his lunch or a picture of the books that he was studying. He would even ask me my opinion on certain topics. And without fail, every single night for 3 weeks, he would text me and ask me if I got home safe. He would ask me what I had for dinner. The thing is, we live 6 hours away from each other. On the 3rd week, he says, I have to meet you. He said he would take off the weekend and drive over to me. I offered to meet him halfway, but he declined. He left at 1 in the morning and arrived at 6 a.m. And of course, we would spend the entire day together. We went to breakfast and the sparks were flying. There was sexy tension between us. He was kissing me, holding my hand, hugging me. It's like he couldn't keep his hands off me. Then we went to the beach for 3 hours where we tanned. Then we went to a cute museum. We had ice cream and then we went to lunch. We had been together 5 hours at this point and he kept saying how much he liked me. But at lunch, he says he needs to go to the bathroom. 10 minutes later, I'm wondering where he is. That's when I get a message saying, I'm so sorry, I can't do this. I have to go. When I go to call him, he doesn't answer. He blocked me on Instagram and on WhatsApp. I created another account and went to his Instagram only to see his wife and kids on his story. Now I want revenge. What should I do?
Story time about how I walked in on my mom doing the dirty with my husband. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I'm sending me on Instagram. I believe my mom is a narcissist. If you ask her, she's the best mom in the world. She was a teenager in the 90s. She had me when she was 17. Growing up, she would always tell me that I ruined her body and that because of me, she wasn't able to date all the guys she wanted to date. The worst part is my dad could have been in my life. He loved my mom and he would beg my mom to get back together when she was pregnant. But because he didn't have money, because he was a 17-year-old kid too, she rejected him and told him that she would find somebody with money. She actually did. My mom worked at a gym during her pregnancy. She met a man who owned 2 businesses and was very, very wealthy. We lived with him until I was 6 years old. But then my mom cheated on him, so he kicked us out of his house. Ever since I can remember, my mom was always competing with me. Now listen, my mom is a very, very good looking woman. She has an hourglass body. She looks banging. But she always hated that I was just as pretty as her. I met my now husband when I was 19. This boy was obsessed with me and asked me to marry him a year later. And my mom made sure to flirt with him whenever she could. He said he used to find it funny, but now I know he liked it. A year after we got married, I thought everything was great. I decided to take the day off from work, but I didn't tell my husband so that I could surprise him with a nice lunch. I go to the grocery store and when I come home, my mom and him are on the couch. And my mom is on top of him, naked. My stomach fell out of my ass. I kicked my husband out, and guess what my mom said? You see, I knew he would cheat on you. I was just trying to help you out. I did kick my mom out, but I let her come back. Instead, I moved my grandma into my house, and my mom is now living with us too. And no, she hasn't apologized. And my husband is begging me to let him come back. What should I do? Story time about how I found out my husband was gay on our wedding night. Disclaimer, it's not my story time, it's not even on Instagram. Hubby and I met through our parents. He worked for my dad, and my dad thought he was a great catch. He told my mom about him, and they set us up on a blind date. 3 things happened on this blind date. He wooed me by saying everything a 30-something-year-old woman would really want to hear, especially on a first date. First off, he started off by talking about how wonderful my parents are. Then he started complimenting everything about me. My clothing, my hair, my makeup, even the way that I spoke, and even the way that I was chewing my food on this date. And I became completely infatuated. We immediately start dating, but with a caveat. He tells me that he does not want to rush into a physical relationship because of his religious views. And so I accepted this. 6 months later, he proposed. And as you can imagine, I was desperate to get married. I really wanted that physical part of our relationship to happen. We had a serene beach wedding. Our closest friends and family attended. Both of our families loved each other. So we end the wedding night. We're headed to our hotel room. And as soon as I think we're about to get it on, he tells me that he's never actually been with a woman before. That he had only been with men before that. Number one, I was completely shocked by this. He had never told me this before, but I couldn't let it stop me. So as we tried to keep going, he just couldn't perform. That's when he turns to me and says, I actually don't think I'm very much attracted to women. Does that bother you? I literally fell apart in that moment. My new husband is now telling me he's not even attracted to me. My friends think he just wanted to marry me because of my parents' wealth and because he works for my dad. The marriage has not been consummated yet, and he said that he would try to make things work with me physically, but that I just need to give him time. My parents do not know, and I feel so ashamed. I don't know if it's me or if it's him. What should I do? Story time about how I dated my mom's graper. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, and trigger warning for grape. I had a very charmed upbringing. My parents were both independently wealthy and pretty much gave me everything I ever wanted. I'm also an only child, so I got their attention constantly. When I was 17, my mom and dad started having problems, and the only reason I found out is because I would hear them arguing from time to time. But in front of me, they always made the effort to be kind to each other. About a year later, I met this really cute guy at the gym. He made every effort to talk to me for about a week. Finally, after a week, he asked me out on a date, and I said yes. He was extremely charming, good-looking, handsome, kind, intelligent, everything you could ever want in a man. And did I mention that he was a very successful businessman? He had a house in Aspen, one in California, and properties all over Texas. We dated for 2 months, and all I really noticed was that he was very jealous. If he caught a guy looking at me, he would get very upset. He was very territorial, and at first I thought this just meant that he loved me. Do you see where this is going? To confuse you some more, 6 months before I met this guy, my mom had been raped. It happened while she was showing some property. The guy was never caught. My mom spent about a week in the hospital. She became a recluse. She went to live in a cabin that my dad and her owned. Well, during Christmas, I decided to take my boyfriend to this cabin. Go to part 2.
Story time about how I dated my mom's graper. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. And trigger warning for grape. After my mom got graped, she became a recluse and went to live in this really fancy cabin her and my dad owned. And like I said, I started dating this guy and it was right around Christmas. So I decided to take him to meet my parents at the cabin. Like I said, my mom was a recluse and she just wasn't the same after the grape, which of course I completely understand. It was a very traumatic thing that she went through. So when I brought my boyfriend at the time over, I could tell there was something up. She tried to stay away from him, didn't talk to him, and basically wouldn't even look him in the eye. The day after he and I arrived, she asked me if we could leave. I was extremely offended. I didn't understand why she didn't like him and she wouldn't tell me. I even got into a huge argument with my mom defending him. My boyfriend actually left earlier and that's when my mom told me everything. My boyfriend was her graper. It all started when she had an affair with him. The affair lasted 2 months and when she broke it off, he became obsessed. He followed her everywhere, called her every single day. And I remember that my parents had changed their phone number and I couldn't figure out why. My mom and I were both in tears. I came to the realization that I had done it with my mom's graper, and my mom was still dealing with her own trauma. We decided to tell my dad the truth. When we all went to confront him, his house was empty. There were no signs of him. He changed his number, and we never saw him again. We keep getting phone calls though, and I think it's him. He used me to get close to my mom. What should I do? My girlfriend abandoned me on my birthday so she could go hang out with her guy best friend. Part 2. After I told her I did not want her best friend coming to my birthday getaway, she threw a tantrum, called him, and complained about me in front of me to him. I was actually so hurt that I grabbed the phone and hung up. She looked at me and told me that I had no right to take the phone from her and blah, blah, blah. That's when I broke down into tears and asked her point blank, do you have a crush on this guy? Immediately she said no. But then she told me she had a confession. She proceeded to tell me that they both lost each other's V cards to each other. And that's why they were so close. And that because they're trying to work on their relationship, I should let him come to my birthday trip. The one I'm paying for. I asked her if she had feelings for him once again and she said no. And then I asked her if he has feelings for her. This girl just stayed quiet. Then she had the gall to say, what if he does? Is that really that bad? I actually had to explain to her why that would be a bad situation. Finally, my birthday comes around and she is nowhere to be seen. I was waiting for her in my car to drive to the cabin with her. An hour later, after she's supposed to be there, she sends me a text saying that she's gonna stay with him and that hopefully this distance will make our relationship stronger. Instead, I took my whole family to the cabin and now I'm ignoring her. Now she's been calling me nonstop. I took her not showing up as a breakup, but she wants me back. What should I do? My girlfriend left me on my birthday to go be with her guy best friend. I, female 22, and my girlfriend 22. We both came out at the same time, and we were actually best friends before we came out. The reason why we both became best friends was because we both knew we were gay, but we didn't really tell anybody, but we knew each other was gay, if you know what I mean. We've been together for 6 months, and everything has been actually pretty good, with the exception of her guy best friend moving back to the city. When I met this guy, I knew right away that he has feelings for my girlfriend, especially when he gets drunk. He gets super handsy with her. Obviously, I told my girlfriend that I didn't like him around her at all, but she put her foot down and told me that I had no say in it because he was her best friend. I basically didn't bring it up again, but they would hang out all the time and they were always together by themselves. They never invited me to go along with them. My birthday was coming up and her and I had already booked a little cabin in the woods. We were very excited about this, but then she slowly started to ask me if I wouldn't mind if her best friend joined us, and I told her I didn't want him to be there. It was my birthday and I was paying for the cabin. You see, my girlfriend's really broke, so I basically pay for everything. Then she threw a tantrum and said that I was being controlling and that I didn't want to let her have fun. Then she picks up the phone and calls her best friend to complain about me in front of me. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, is not my story time, it's sending me on Instagram. I'm 24 years old and my boyfriend is 21. According to him, he has never been with any girl who's had cellulite before, or even an ounce of body fat. Yes, I know what you're thinking, he's a total asshole, which in that sense, he is. But the rest of the time, he's completely fine and actually sweet. We met last year at a friend's party. At the party, I instantly fell in love with him. I thought he was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen in my entire life. And it was reciprocated. I saw him from across the room and he made eye contact. A few minutes later, he walked over to me and just struck up a conversation. I know that people present themselves the way they want to be seen, especially when they're trying to impress someone they're attracted to. He started telling me about how he's studying to be a doctor, how he volunteers at animal shelters, and that every single weekend he also volunteers at the soup kitchen. Everything he said was absolutely perfect. By the end of the night, he had asked me out on a date and I said yes. I did explain to him that I didn't want anything serious and he said that was totally fine. I was trying to focus on my studies, so having a boyfriend was not in my plans. But after we went on 7 dates, he asked me to be his girlfriend. He wouldn't take no for an answer. After about a month, I finally said yes. Mind you, at this point, he hadn't seen me naked, not even in a bathing suit. The very night that I said yes to being his girlfriend, he asked me to come over to his place. He made a whole gourmet dinner, even bought super expensive wine. So we ended up doing it for the first time that night. The next morning when I woke up, the first thing he said to me was, "Do you ever exercise?" I was shocked. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimers are not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. That's when he said point blank, super serious, "Do you ever exercise?" I just stared at him. I had literally just woken up in his bed after the first time we ever did it. Then I thought he must be joking. So I started to laugh a little, and then he says, "No, seriously, do you ever exercise?" I said, "Sometimes." Then he told me, "You should really try to work out at least 5 times a week." I went home and finally texted him saying that I wasn't comfortable with the way he spoke to me. That's when he said that what he said to me was completely normal, and that I shouldn't be offended. This was all in text, by the way. That's when he sends me another text message saying, "You know, you wouldn't have as much cellulite as you do if you didn't eat so much fast food. And if you exercise 5 times a week like I told you." I didn't reply to him for the rest of the day. Later that day, he shows up to my apartment and says, "You know, I should feel comfortable enough to tell you what I think about you." He somehow ended up making me feel bad and I ended up apologizing. Obviously, after that, I became really self-conscious about my cellulite and my entire body. So anytime we were together, I would always stay under the covers. By the way, my boyfriend doesn't have a great body. He's super soft and pudgy. Last week, he told me that he had abs though. Part 3 is story time about how my boyfriend shames me for having cellulite. Disclaimer, it's not my story time. It's sent me on Instagram. One day, he pulls up his shirt and says, "Look, I have abs." Which, no, he doesn't. He's super soft and has a thick layer of fat on it. I smirked and he said, "What?" And I said, "You don't have abs." Then he says, "Yes, I do. I'm in better shape than you." By the way, he said this in front of his friends, so I was super embarrassed and stayed quiet the entire day. He finally went to drop me off and I was so happy to be home. But he decided to come upstairs with me. Got straight into my PJs. And when I came out of my bedroom, he says, "Wow, your cellulite's getting worse by the day." That's when I finally broke. I turned around and started yelling at him. I told him he had no right to talk about my body the way that he did, and that all he does is objectify me. He started laughing and said, "Wow, those are big words." And that when we met, he thought that I was in better shape. My clothes obviously tricked him. I'm 5'4" and I weigh 130 pounds. I am by no means fat, but the way that he was bullying me was making me think that I was. That's when I told him that he was the fat one, and that he had a big, huge beer belly. I also told him that his face was super round, but that didn't bother me. Oh yeah, and that his hairy back was gross. Then he said, "Wow, I can't believe you're attacking my physical appearance." Then he stormed out of my apartment, and as soon as he left, I felt happy. We haven't spoken in 4 days. I'm afraid that if he asks me to get back with him, I will. But I should just break up with him, right? What should I do? Story time about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. Tell you that last month I made $60,000. This clearly is not my story time and send me on Instagram. So at the beginning I had to lie about my age. I'm really 36 years old, but I say I'm 22. I do look a lot younger than I am, and of course I get filler and Botox. I started my Instagram account 6 years ago. My inspirations were Anna Cherie, Amanda Lee, I am JoJo, and Abigail Ratchford. I mean Abigail Ratchet. I basically copied all of these girls' pictures. Within a month of starting my Instagram account, I had 10,000 followers. And yes, all of them were males. But I didn't really start making money until 2018. You know, like every other girl on Instagram, I signed up for OF. And that's when I started making serious money. But I was also making money from Instagram. Brands would send me clothes and watches and protein powder, stuff like that. Eventually, I became an ambassador for one of the biggest Instagram clothing stores. I think we all know what I'm talking about. Fashion Hova, and I started making a lot of money then. So I basically started living above my means. I got myself a new apartment in Beverly Hills, and it was $6,000 a month. I also got myself a Mercedes, and I would exclusively shop at Air One. I would also go shopping at Rodeo Drive almost every day because I wanted the paparazzi to get pictures of me. And I even called the paparazzi on me a few times, so I had to pay them like $2,000 out of pocket. So yeah, I was spending a lot of money. Whatever money I got that month, I would literally spend it by the end. One month I spent $25,000 going out with friends. I would usually pick up the bill. This is what started getting me into trouble. Part 2 is story time about how I became an IG model / escort for billionaires. After I spent the $25,000 in 1 month, I decided I needed another income source. So I thought of escorting. One of my very good friends in LA was also an escort, and she told me about it, but I was like, I can't do that. But one day I called her and she told me everything. She gets contacted through Instagram by very, very rich men, like billionaires. I honestly didn't believe her at first, but then she showed me receipts. Her bank account had more than $1 million in it. She told me that she had only been doing it for 6 months.
She put me in contact with several people and they had to verify a bunch of my stuff. Then after a week, I was finally in. I was really scared. I had to go get my passport renewed. This meant that I was going to be traveling internationally with men that I didn't know. A few days later, I get a message on Instagram from an account. The guy that owned this account was clearly very rich. It wasn't him contacting me, it was his assistant. He got my information and 2 days later, I was on a private plane. I landed in a foreign country and I spent the entire weekend with this guy. He didn't speak English. Basically took me around his city and showed me off for his friends. I honestly didn't feel uncomfortable at any point and he didn't try anything. In fact, he was actually super shy, but his friends on the other hand were really handsy. Part 3 is up. Storytime about how I became an Instagram model / escort for billionaires. That's when his friends started getting really handsy. We were in a really expensive high-rise and the apartment was literally worth millions. And I knew that all of these guys were used to getting whatever they wanted. One of the friends actually grabbed my arm and told me to sit on his lap, but I told him I couldn't. He wasn't the one that hired me to be there, so I had to go straight to the guy that hired me. I told him that his friends were making me uncomfortable and he said, okay, we should leave then. I was actually shocked that he listened to what I wanted. Now one of my regular clients and I travel with him almost every 2 months. So let me tell you how much he paid me. For the 3-day weekend, I ended up with $50,000. Yep, that's right. But let me tell you a little about the dark side of this. A few jobs later, I ended up with somebody who was completely crazy. I ended up going to Vegas with this guy. He was approximately 10 years younger than me and was filthy rich. But he was also a complete psycho. He bought me this whole outfit that he wanted me to wear the entire night. I told him I was more comfortable in my clothes. I was wearing a Fendi dress. It looked great. That's when he said, no, you're gonna wear this. I ended up walking around Vegas in a micro mini skirt and a bikini top. By the end of this night, he was getting really aggressive. I tried to stay quiet, hoping that he would just forget that I was in his car. Suddenly, he turned to look at me and wanted me to do something. When I said no, he grabbed me by the hair and told me that he owned me for the night. Then he said, I'll add an extra $20,000 in there for you. And it does get worse. But now I learned to save my money. I no longer pay for my friends' drinks and food. I still have my $6,000 apartment and I upgraded my car. I live like a princess. I also bought my parents a house though. It was definitely one of the happiest days of my life. And believe it or not, I actually did end up finding love. My boyfriend is okay with my job, but he just asked me to be safe. Of course, he asked me every day to quit because he wants to support me, but he can't give me the life I've given myself. What should I do? Storytime about how a strange man abused me because I did not want to give him my phone number. Disclaimer is not my story time. I sent him on Instagram. That's when he slid his hand onto my lap. I quickly get up from the table and ask him to leave. That's when he said, why are you freaking out? I'm just trying to get your number. Then I told him that there was absolutely zero chance I would ever give him my phone number. And he said, oh, you think you have a choice? And he holds out his phone so that I could type in my number. I pushed his phone back and again asked him to leave. And he threatened me and said that he wouldn't leave until I gave him my number. My knees and hands were shaking. Look back at my employees behind the counter and they are scared. That's when one of my employees says, I'm gonna call the cops. And I said, yes, call them. As soon as I turned back to this man, he swings at me. He wasn't able to reach my face, but then he grabbed me by the shoulders and pushed me down onto the ground. This all happened in about 30 seconds. As I'm on the ground, he starts slapping me. I covered my face with my arms and I just started kicking at him. And my 2 female employees, who by the way are like 17 and 18, start attacking the guy. And then he starts hitting them. Thankfully, 2 men from the street hear me yelling. I came in and tackled him and the police arrived 2 minutes later. I found out this guy was stalking me for a month. I got a restraining order. Be careful. Storytime about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. Send me on Instagram. I come from a really big family. My mom has 5 sisters and 1 brother, and my dad has 4 brothers and sisters. All of them have their own kids, so I have a lot of cousins. And this means we have a lot of family get-togethers. Every single weekend, someone is hosting a party. We all get together and eat, and it's actually a really nice time. But there's always that one creepy uncle. In my case, it's my mom's brother. He's 46-year-old and has never married, but he's a bachelor. He's got money, so he basically has a bunch of sugar babies. Whenever my family tells him that he needs to get married, he says he'll never get married to anybody. He thinks women only exist for the pleasure of men. When I turned 16, I noticed that he would stare at me a lot. At first, it was just staring. Every now and again, he never did anything really creepy then, but just the staring was enough for me. I never told my mom about it then, not until I turned 18. This is when he started making comments like, wow, you're growing into your body, or wow, you got great hips. He would make comments about how I was growing up, like, ew. He even told my dad that he needed to keep me away from guys because I was growing up really quickly. And because of my curves, men would think that I was a woman. This is when I finally told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable. She thought it was funny at first, so I avoided him at all costs. Part 2. Storytime about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's me on Instagram. When I told my mom that he was making me super uncomfortable, she laughed it off. She thought it was funny. She said, oh, you know how he is. So from that point on, I basically avoided my uncle every time we were at a family event. When I turned 20, this is when things got even worse. He would ask me things like if I was a virgin, or if I had a boyfriend, if I had ever been on dates. And one time he even told me that he would get very jealous if I ended up bringing a guy to one of our family events. One time he complimented me on the dress that I was wearing, so after that, I only wore baggy clothes to family events. dress. The fact that I had to change the way that I dress so that he could control himself makes me sick. I finally told my mom again that my uncle was always bothering me. That's when she told me that the world is filled with men like him, and that all I needed to do was just ignore him. So I told my dad everything. My dad took it a little more seriously and told my uncle that he needed to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my creepy uncle flirts with me. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sent me on Instagram. I finally told my dad and he told my uncle to stop making comments. My uncle just laughed and told my dad that he was overreacting, and that all he said to me was that I was a pretty girl. What a liar. In part 1 and 2, I told you guys that it was getting worse, but here's where it actually gets even worse. Like I said, I have a really big family, so my cousins are growing up too. One of them just turned 13 and my uncle cannot stop staring at her. She's maturing a lot quicker than most 13-year-olds. He's already staring at her. So here's what I did. At the next family event, I sat right next to him. Every time he would stare at one of my cousins or try to make a comment at me, I called him out for it in front of everybody. I even recorded the things that he said. The fact that I even have to do this at a family event makes me sick. Instead of enjoying my time with my family, I have to sit next to my creepy uncle policing him. Anyway, it's totally worth it though. I'm making sure that my cousins don't feel uncomfortable. After I had enough recordings of him saying nasty things, at the next family event, I showed it to my grandma. I basically played it for the entire family. My grandma told him that he couldn't come to any more events if he was going to behave that way. And of course, he apologized to everyone right away. But not to me, he apologized to my dad. After his half-ass apology, he was let back into family events. I don't think that's enough punishment. Give me some ideas because I think I deserve justice. Creepy uncle.
Story time about how my grandma got married when she was 14 years old. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sent me on Instagram. So just picture it. I'm sitting with my 94-year-old grandma in the kitchen, and suddenly she starts talking about my grandpa. My grandpa passed away almost 10 years ago. And to be fair, they did have a wonderful marriage. By all accounts, and by all of my family's accounts, they were totally in love until the moment he took his last breath. Here's how the story goes. The first time they met, she was 12 years old. He had just gotten back from the war. She was walking home from school with her backpack, and my 27-year-old grandpa pulls up in his car. He starts to tell her that she's going to be his future wife, and that he's going to talk to her parents so that they can get married. He kept inviting her into his car, but she kept saying no. He followed her home from school every single day. As my grandma is telling the story, everyone is laughing, except for me. Finally, one day he followed her to her house, knocked on the door, and requested to speak to my great-grandfather. They spoke for an hour, and that's when my great-grandpa promised my grandma to my grandpa, and he gave them permission to get married when she was 14. At first, he wanted them to get to know each other, so they started going on dates. Part 2 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sent me on Instagram. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. This is when my great-grandfather promised my 12-year-old grandma to my 27-year-old grandfather. My great-grandpa thought that it would be best they wait 2 years so that they can get married when she's 14. In the meantime, he suggested that they start going out on dates. Yes, a 12-year-old girl and a 27-year-old man. By the way, as my grandma is telling this story, all of my cousins are laughing at this. I'm trembling in my seat. She explained to us that for those 2 years, my grandfather was on his best behavior, and that essentially they read books together, they walked together by the lake, and he would take her out to see movies. She said at the time it was a big deal. Going to the movies was like a big treat. I guess it made me feel better knowing that he didn't try to do anything to her at the time. Still, it's absolutely disgusting. Finally, the 2 years pass, and at this point, they're totally in love. They get married. Both their families attended this wedding. How did no one in their families think it was inappropriate? Watching a 14-year-old get married to a 29-year-old man? But it gets worse. Part 3 is up. Story time about how my grandma married my grandpa when she was 14 years old and he was 29. Disclaimer, this is not my story time, it's sent me on Instagram. This is the third and last part. And if you want longer story times, go to my YouTube. 2 years pass and they get married. My grandma even told us that the night of their wedding, my great-grandparents gifted them a night at a hotel so that they could have some privacy. You can imagine what happened. My grandmother described it as the most liberating night of her life. 2 months later, she was pregnant. Their first baby was born right before she turned 15, and then she got pregnant again at 15, and then at 17, and then at 18, 19, and finally 20. My grandfather got into oil in his late 20s. He made about $1 million by the time he was 35, so he was able to give them a very comfortable life. He purchased a manor. They had 3 housekeepers, 1 butler, and 4 nannies, and they had a really happy life. My grandma says my grandpa was always affectionate with her, and she said they blessed their bed every single night. After she finishes telling the story, all of my cousins laugh and think it's cute. I was disturbed. I asked her why it was okay to get married at such a young age. And then I said, would you have wanted me to get married when I was 14? That's when she said that times were just different back then. The war was happening, and people didn't know if they would live or die. She also said that when a catch like my grandfather turned up, most parents were looking for a man like my grandfather to marry off their daughters. Grandpa was educated, handsome, driven, had great work ethic, and he took care of her, which is what he promised my great-grandpa. And then when the children came, he more than took care of them. He even took care of my great-grandparents too. He ended up moving them into the manor in their old age, and they were fully taken care of by the staff. Apparently, the manor was big enough to fit in 4 families. Now, I loved my grandfather. He was a great, kind man, and I myself benefited off the generational wealth. He paid for my education, and I'm now a lawyer for it. But still, a huge part of me feels absolutely disgusted with the history of their love. Even though back then that might have been normal, I think it's horrendous. Yes, they had a great love story, but she was a child. Apparently, this was a big family secret. None of the uncles or my parents wanted us to know. I got into a huge argument with my parents for hiding this from me. They think I'm totally overreacting. Am I, though? I guess I'll need more therapy. What do you think? Story time about how I married a married man. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It was sent me on Instagram. Years ago, I met this guy that I thought was really cute. Stupid and naive, and I believed everything he said. I worked in customer service. He came into my job one day and just started flirting with me, and I was like thrilled. My job was really boring. This cute guy comes in and just starts talking to me, and I just fall in love. I'm not exaggerating. I know it's pathetic. I couldn't believe that he was talking to me and that he was interested in me. The next day, he asked me for my phone number, and I gave it to him. I went on one date, and I was legit in love. It starts to get creepy. He was 20 years older than me, and you could say he GROOMED'd me. See, I didn't know what was happening. I was 19, I had never had a boyfriend, and I barely had ever been kissed. Played me like a fiddle. After 2 weeks of going on dates, he finally kissed me. I knew that he was the man I wanted to marry. But when I told my coworker about him, she told me that he was married. I asked him about it. He told me that my coworker must have been mistaking him for his brother, because his brother and him had similar names and the brother was married. 2 days later, I asked one of his friends about it. That's when his friend tells me that he doesn't even have a brother, and that he had been married for 15 years to a girl that was also 20 years younger than him. Even knowing this, I still married him. And you'll never guess how. Part 2 is already up. Story time about how I married a guy who was already married. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. It's gonna be on Instagram. Even though I knew he was already married to somebody else, and even though I knew he lied to me about already being married, I still went ahead and married him. I was completely obsessed with him. Because he was already legally married to somebody else, we decided to use a different name for him, and somehow it worked. We actually drove 5 hours away to get married, used fake names, filed in a different state, and then we drove back to our hometown, where literally no one knew we were married. It was our little secret. But then the poo hit the fan. He kept promising that he would leave his wife. But one day, I'm having dinner with my parents at a restaurant, and guess who shows up? My husband with his wife. And boy, did they look happy. He was all over her, kissing her neck and her hands. Not only until he realized that I was in the restaurant did he stop. Then he actually had the audacity to come to my table, introduce himself to my parents, and tell him that he knew me from my job. All the while, his wife was sitting at the table looking at me. And in that moment, I knew that she knew something was up. It's like she stared straight into my soul. She must have seen the way that I was looking at him, because she ran up to the table and introduced herself to me and my parents. When she tried to shake my hand, I didn't shake it back. My parents told me I was being rude, so I forced myself to shake her hand. 2 days later, she calls me and asks me what's up. But I lied and said that her husband was just a friend. Then I got an idea. I decided to be her friend. I asked her out to coffee, and we had a great time. And little did she know that she was sitting with her husband's new wife. I feel like this way I can try to control their relationship from the inside. I confessed everything to my mom, and she thinks I'm crazy. I think I'm a little crazy too. Am I completely wrong for this?